I should have known better than to venture out to that lake alone. The stories I'd heard, whispers of strange happenings, tales of people who'd gone missing without a trace, should have been enough to keep me away. But I'd always been the skeptical type, the one who needed to see things for himself. When my friend mentioned the lake's eerie reputation in passing, it piqued my curiosity more than it should have. I was craving solitude, an escape from the relentless noise of the city, and the idea of a secluded fishing trip seemed perfect. The drive out to the lake took longer than I expected. The road wound through dense forest, narrowing to little more than a dirt path as I got closer. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches intertwining overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnervingly as the sun began to set. When I finally arrived, the lake was just as my friend had described, a still, mirror-like surface surrounded by dense woods, with no signs of civilization in sight. It was beautiful in a stark, haunting way, the kind of beauty that feels almost unnatural. The water was so clear it reflected the sky perfectly, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. I set up camp quickly, eager to start fishing before the light faded completely. As I unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an unsettling sensation, one that I tried to ignore as I cast my line into the water and settled into the tranquility of the moment. But the unease lingered, a low hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. The first few hours were uneventful. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned a deep, inky blue. As the night grew darker, the air became colder, and the lake took on a different character. The peacefulness that had drawn me there now felt oppressive, the silence almost deafening. I cooked a simple dinner over a small campfire, the crackling flames providing a comforting contrast to the dark, still water. But even as I ate, I found myself glancing at the lake, expecting something. I didn't know what, but the feeling of being watched had intensified, and it was starting to unnerve me. I decided to try night fishing. I'd heard stories of people catching enormous fish after dark, and the thought intrigued me. I cast my line into the lake, the plunk of the bait hitting the water echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I settled into my chair, watching the line disappear into the darkness, and tried to relax. But the feeling of unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. It wasn't long before I felt the first tug on my line. I reeled in quickly, expecting another small catch, but what surfaced made my heart skip a beat. The fish was massive, far larger than anything I'd ever caught before. Its scales glistened under the moonlight, a slick, almost oily sheen that caught the light in a way that made my stomach churn. Its eyes, larger than any fish's eyes should be, stared up at me, unblinking, almost human in their intensity. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just a big fish, nothing more. But as I unhooked it, the fish let out a low, guttural sound, a sound that no fish should make. It was a deep, resonant noise that seemed to vibrate through my bones, sending a shiver down my spine. I quickly tossed the fish back into the water, watching as it disappeared into the depths with a sickening splash. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat there, gripping my rod with white-knuckled intensity, waiting for something to happen. But the lake remained still, the water as calm and unperturbed as ever. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the fish had been a fluke, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. A few minutes later, I felt another strong tug on my line, stronger this time, as if something was trying to drag me into the water. I fought against it, the rod bending under the strain, and when I finally managed to reel in the catch, I was met with something that defied explanation. It wasn't a fish, at least not entirely. The creature that surfaced was grotesque, its bulbous body covered in slimy, mottled skin that seemed to writhe and pulse as if alive. Its eyes were larger than any creature's eyes should be, black and soulless, staring at me with a malevolent intensity that made my blood run cold. Its mouth gaped open, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous for a fish. I froze, staring at the thing in horror. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. It was as if the creature had crawled out of a nightmare, a twisted, deformed version of something that should never exist. Its body pulsed with a sickening rhythm, and I could feel the air around me grow colder, heavier. My first instinct was to drop the rod and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot, a morbid fascination mixed with terror. The creature's eyes bored into me, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. It was as if the thing was trying to communicate, to tell me something in a language I couldn't understand, a language made up of pure, unadulterated fear. I fumbled with the hook, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The creature let out a low, guttural sound similar to the one the fish had made earlier, but this time it was louder, more insistent. The sound reverberated through my skull, making me dizzy and disoriented. I finally managed to unhook the creature and tossed it back into the lake with a shaky breath. The moment it hit the water, the lake responded in a way that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. The water around it began to churn and bubble violently, as if something enormous was thrashing just beneath the surface. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my mind screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't move. I stood there, staring at the lake as the water continued to roil and boil, the bubbles growing larger, more violent. The dark shapes began to rise from the depths, shifting and undulating in a way that defied explanation. They were massive, their forms indistinct but undeniably alive, moving with a purpose that terrified me. The shapes seemed to move closer, and I finally snapped out of my paralysis. I grabbed my gear and started packing up as quickly as I could, my hands trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back at the lake, but I could hear the splashing, the thrashing of whatever was in the water, growing louder, more frantic. I shoved everything into the boat and pushed off, the water still churning around me. As I rowed, I risked a glance back at the lake and felt my heart seize in my chest. The shapes were following me, moving beneath the surface with an unnatural speed. They were huge, far larger than any fish could be, and their dark, undulating forms made my stomach churn with fear. The boat rocked violently, as if something massive was trying to pull me back. I rowed harder, my muscles straining, my mind racing with terror. When I finally reached the shore, I was drenched in sweat, my hands shaking so badly. I could barely tie the boat to the dock. I grabbed what little I could carry and fled to my car, not daring to look back. The drive back was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind kept replaying the images of those dark, shifting shapes, the grotesque creature that had surfaced, the unnatural way the lake had reacted. It was as if the lake itself was alive, angry at being disturbed, and it had let me go only reluctantly. I've always found a strange sense of peace in night fishing. There's something about the stillness of the lake under the blanket of darkness, the soft lapping of water against the boat, and the occasional hoot of an owl that just puts me at ease. The night felt endless, with only the faint light of the crescent moon illuminating the surroundings. I'd chosen a spot far from the city lights, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the water's surface. It was just me, my thoughts, and the endless expanse of black water. I'd been sitting there for hours, my line cast far into the lake, waiting for a bite that never seemed to come. Time moved strangely, and the dark minutes felt like hours, and I lost track of how long I'd been out there. The trees surrounding the lake stood tall and imposing, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. I could barely make out their shapes, just dark silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. The air was cool, and a mist began to rise from the water, giving everything an eerie, almost otherworldly quality. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around myself, but it wasn't the cold that was bothering me. There was something else, a feeling I couldn't shake. I don't know when I first noticed it, but I became aware of a shadow moving among the trees. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, maybe just the wind playing with the branches. But as I watched, the shadow grew more distinct, more solid, like something or someone was lurking just out of sight. I strained my eyes, trying to make out what it was. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to glide between the trees without making a sound. My heart began to pound in my chest as I realized that whatever it wasn't an animal. It moved with purpose, almost like it was watching me. I forced myself to look away, telling myself I was just imagining things. But every time I glanced back, the shadow was closer, inching its way toward the edge of the trees. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I tried to focus on my fishing, but the line remained still. No fish were biting, no distractions from the growing dread that gnawed at my gut. My eyes kept darting back to the trees, drawn to the shadow that was now unmistakably closer. It was almost at the shoreline, still hidden among the dark shapes of the trees, but I could see it more clearly now. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long, too spindly. Then it stopped, just at the edge of the trees, as if it knew I was watching. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unblinking. My heart thundered in my ears, and I fought the urge to run. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being ridiculous. But the fear was too real, too palpable. Without thinking, I began to reel in my line, my hands shaking. I had to leave. Now, the figure hadn't moved, but I could feel it watching, waiting. As I finally got the line out of the water, I fumbled with the oars, my movements clumsy in my panic. I pushed off from the shore, the boat gliding slowly across the lake's surface. I didn't dare look back at the trees, but I could feel the presence of the figure, still watching. I rowed frantically, my muscles screaming with each stroke. The mist had thickened, enveloping the boat in a ghostly shroud, and visibility was nearly zero. But I couldn't afford to slow down. I had to distance myself from that menacing shadow. I pulled the boat onto the land with trembling legs. As I glanced back across the water, the mist had swallowed the trees, and the shadow was no longer visible. I rushed back to my car. I climbed inside. As I started the engine and drove away, the headlights sliced through the darkness. Even as I drove away, the image of that shadowy figure haunted me. What had I truly seen? Who or what had been lurking in the woods? I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure I ever will. But one thing is certain: I won't be returning to that lake. Never again. I've always loved fishing, especially at night. There's a certain serenity in the darkness that you can't find during the day. One fateful October night, I decided to drive out to a remote lake. The drive was uneventful. Though the roads grew narrower and more treacherous, I went deeper into the wilderness. As I drove, I could feel a sense of isolation creeping in, a reminder that I was miles away from the nearest town or house. It was exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. When I finally arrived at the lake, I was struck by how eerily silent it was. There was no sound of animals, no rustling of leaves, just an oppressive stillness that settled over the area like a shroud. The air was crisp, biting at my exposed skin, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on the task at hand, setting up my rod, casting my line, and settling in for a few hours of peaceful solitude. The water lapped gently against the shore as I sat down on an old, weathered log, my tackle box by my side. The minutes passed and I began to relax, the tension from the drive slowly ebbing away. It was just me and the night, the way I liked it. But then, the whispers started. At first, I didn't pay them much mind. I figured it was just the wind playing tricks on my ears as it moved through the trees. I tried to focus on my fishing, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in the dark. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the whispers wouldn't go away. They grew louder, more insistent, and I could almost swear I could hear my name being called, though I couldn't make out the words. I scanned the shoreline, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing there. The lake remained still, the trees unmoving. Yet the whispers continued, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. It was as if something or someone was out there, watching me, waiting for something. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat began to form on my brow. I've spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, and I've heard all sorts of sounds: animals, the wind, the distant rumble of thunder, but nothing like this. There was something deeply unsettling about these whispers, something that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint, flickering light on the other side of the lake. It was small, barely noticeable, but in the darkness, it stood out like a beacon. I stared at it, trying to figure out what it could be. At first, I thought it might be another fisherman, but there was no one else around. The light didn't move, it just flickered, like a candle in the wind. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself standing up, my gear forgotten. I knew I should have packed up and left right then and there, but something about that light drew me in. It was almost hypnotic, pulling me toward it despite the growing sense of dread in my gut. I grabbed my flashlight and started making my way around the lake, my footsteps crunching on the gravelly shore. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. They were no longer just a background noise, they were all around me, pressing in from every direction. The trees loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, casting long, spidery shadows on the ground. As I got closer to the light, I realized it was coming from a small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. It was old, the wood dark and weathered, with patches of moss clinging to the walls. The windows were broken and the roof sagged in the middle, as if it had been abandoned for years. The light was coming from inside, a soft, flickering glow that seemed to pulse in time with the whispers. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something was compelling me to move forward, to find out what was inside that cabin. The whispers were almost deafening now, a chorus of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step toward the cabin, then another, until I was standing in front of the door. It was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges that creaked ominously as I pushed it open. The interior of the cabin was dark, the only light coming from a single candle in the center of the room. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay, and a sense of unease washed over me as I crossed the threshold. The room was small, barely furnished, with an old, rotting table in the middle and a few broken chairs scattered about. The walls were lined with shelves, but whatever had once been on them had long since disintegrated into dust. The floor was covered in a thick layer of grime, and the only sound was the steady drip of water from the ceiling, which had begun to leak. But it wasn't the state of the cabin that sent a chill down my spine, it was the figure standing at the far end of the room. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its form was barely discernible in the darkness. It was more of a silhouette than anything else, a shadowy figure that seemed to blend in with the gloom. But there was something about it that was deeply, profoundly wrong. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For a moment, I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The whispers were louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that filled the room, echoing off the walls and reverberating in my skull. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate, pleading. My fight or flight response kicked in, and I turned and bolted out of the cabin, the door slamming shut behind me with a loud crash. I didn't stop to look back, I couldn't. I ran through the woods, branches whipping against my face. The whispers followed me, chasing me through the trees, growing fainter as I put more distance between myself and that cursed place. By the time I reached my truck, I was out of breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The tires spun on the gravel as I sped away, the headlights cutting through the darkness as I tore down the narrow, winding road. It wasn't until I was miles away from the lake that I finally dared to look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there, no light, no shadowy figure, just the empty road behind me. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something from that cabin had followed me, lurking just out of sight. I've never been back to that lake, and I never will.